Hello and welcome to this week's vlog from Madison's. Well, as promised this week, I'm going to give you my outlook for the economy and the property market for 2021. As I record this, probably on the brink of another national lockdown because of that rising COVID rate. And that's something the government are really grappling with. How do they balance protecting our most vulnerable with protecting the economy and the social impact of a lockdown? I think what we've come to learn from COVID is that it's an illness that generally only is fatal for those who are elderly or have underlying health conditions. Generally, if you're fit, healthy and not too old, then you will survive. But of course, the government has got to balance with the hospitals becoming overloaded, other treatments not being able to happen. So huge dilemmas for them. And of course, Boris has wanted to treat that from regional lockdowns, hence this tier 1, 2, 3 system. But looking like the infection rate is spreading. So looking like another lockdown, which will slightly caution my thoughts for next year, just depending on how long that lockdown happens. If it's short, I think we'll be fine. If it's longer, then I'll be recording another vlog with my revised thoughts, but hopefully not too different from the positive outlook that I'm going to give you now. Well, let's just recap first of all. On the last vlog I recorded with the Economic Outlook was recorded on the 24th of April. And at that, I alluded to this thing called the hose pipe analogy, which was basically that during lockdown, a lot of people were either furloughed, so still receiving income, or were working from home, but they were simply unable to spend money. The economy is generally made up of companies making money, people earning money, banks, the central banks producing money, or indeed the commercial banks, and all of that going into the melting pot of the money that sits in the economy, and how it circulates and how many times it circulates is what creates GDP. So as you'd imagine during lockdown, GDP was through the floor. It was very, very negative simply because many people couldn't spend in the normal ways. Online business was very high, but of course it didn't substitute holidays, theatres, leisure, restaurants, pubs, all of those things that we normally would spend our money on couldn't happen. And the media was intensely negative at that point, predicted that GDP for the year would be massively down. And of course, that was when I got very cross and recorded that vlog on the 24th of April because it simply wasn't going to be the case. The minute that lockdown lifted, I predicted the money would flow. Can I remind you, when I recorded that vlog, it was Armageddon predicted out there. Our media is intensely negative, and we have very short memories of that. We take it as gospel, it doesn't then happen, and we forget all those negative predictions that the media made before. I worked through 2.5 years of Brexit, of hearing that prices would crash. They never did once. So during that time when I recorded that lockdown, Armageddon predicted prices predicted to fall by 30%. Many of my esteemed larger corporate estate agents in the town also predicting negative price drops, negative on prices. And I sat there and said 5% rise by the end of the year. So we sit here now, we've come out of lockdown. July, GDP was higher in July than it was in July 2019. So as predicted, when that lockdown lifted, the money flowed. We had Eat Out to Help Out and other incentives, and we've all got used to working in a different environment where we wear masks and social distancing. So the money flowed, the housing market has gone boom, and how easy it is to sit here now and think of all the reasons why that's happened. Lockdown has forced many people's minds to think about what their home achieves for them. But here we sit now on the brink of possibly another lockdown where the government does balance all those effects. And so our media once again has become incredibly mawkish and negative. And the banks, of course, they sit in a world of conservatism and risk, and we're seeing that really affect the first-time buyer market, where they're looking to not lend as much in case there is a price drop. And of course, one of the things the media constantly talks about is unemployment. There's going to be unemployment next year. There's absolutely no doubt about it. There are many sectors that have been hit very, very hard, and so they will be affected. But as you'll see from this graph now, actually, if there are a lot of people who aren't working, there are far, far more who are still working. I think unemployment will probably rise to around 8%, which means that 92% of people will be gainfully employed. There's no doubt there are going to be differences around how we work. Home working will be far more the norm. I think there'll be a rise of a mix, actually, working from home for much of the week and going into the office for maybe meetings, social events, and of course recognising that people want some level of social interaction. But going into the office every day probably isn't going to happen. And I think there will be real regional differences of what could happen in the property market. Areas around the big airports like Crawley, Slough, they will, I think, be affected as we don't get back to full capacity with travel for quite some time. So there will be regional differences. Of course, the young are feeling really quite wealthy at the moment. I think most people gauge their wealth by how much they feel their property is worth. We love property in this country, and how much money's in their bank account. And I think for the young, they've not been spending as much, and so they are therefore sitting on quite good balances, which means they'll want to get onto the housing market. And of course, one of the reasons for that is all around inflation. Now, interestingly, people assume that when there is rising unemployment, that there will also be a correlating fall in house prices. But as my esteemed economist, whose opinions I draw greatly on, Roger Martin Fagg, has shown through history that when unemployment rises, house prices actually rise as well. It's a really interesting pot as to why. I'll happily chat it through anyone who wants to know more about it. It's to do with how the banks lend and our perception of whether we need to sell or not, and how the banks support us during those times. The reality is that prices will only drop if you have forced sellers. So we saw that in 2008. The banks were retracting many of their debts, calling in those loans. And so in 2008, property prices did start to fall. Mortgages are a big part of a bank's business. They pile them high, sell them cheap, and operate on very, very low margins. So if all goes well, they make a bit of money. The reality is where banks charge a lot more to reward them for the risk that they undertake is the SME, the small medium enterprise market, so companies. That is where I know, for example, if I approach the bank to lend money, I'd pay a much higher rate than I would on a mortgage, because the bank knows the risk of default is so much higher for companies. Most mortgages do not default. And I think there'll be enormous pressure on the banks to support people during this time if there is a risk of default from that rising unemployment. And the reality is interest rates remain very, very low. When you sit in an inflationary environment, interest rates are used to try and hold inflation down. So I think it's very unlikely that interest rates will rise next year, which will mean that for most people, their mortgage will remain incredibly affordable. So if you don't have people forced to sell, if you have most of the company gainfully employed, changing the way they work, agreed, changing the way they spend, I think 50% of what we spend will be online by the end of next year, then prices should indeed hold. I think what we've seen from lockdown in the beginning part of this year, or Q2, was we had the deepest but the shortest recession ever. And that was mainly because of the enormous stimulus that the government pumped into the economy. People get very worried about that. They talk about how can the government afford to do this? Well, the simple reality is the central bank prints money. So we've not paid for any of that stimulus through extra taxes. The central banks will simply create a lot more money, lend it to the bank and buy it back. So in fact, what we have seen is the largest economic stimulus into the economy since World War II. So enormous amount of money pumping in. And why has that been so important for the government? Well, I think it's all because of Brexit. Next year cannot be seen to be a failure for the UK economy. We need to show our European colleagues that Brexit was the right thing to happen. And for that reason, the government will continue to provide enormous stimulus to boost the economy. There's no doubt that from all that extra money, we will operate in a more inflation-driven environment. Inflation, Roger Martin Fagg thinks, will go up to about 4% next year. And the reality is, when we sit in an inflationary environment, we love moving to property. Property is a hedge against inflation. It is an asset that appreciates when everything else is going up in price, but it does so in a tax-free environment. So when we sit in an inflationary environment with low interest rates, we flock to property. Combine that with all the behavioural reasons of why people have evaluated what their home does for them, and the fact that Brexit is coming and the government will want to continue to support us, I think prices will rise by 7% next year, 7%. There will be doom and gloom. Our media will love to tell us all about that, but it hasn't been proven to be right thus far. So just remember that every time you hear what's going on. Brexit will see a broad brush trade deal. The detail will take years to resolve, and there probably will be a border in the middle of the Irish Sea. I hope that you've found this report uplifting. Let's see what happens with the next lockdown. I'll give you my next thoughts, and next week back to normal with my usual roundup. Thank you.